Talk about the kinds of sensory analysis feedback that are useful versus those which aren't. As a specialty coffee buyer, communicating about flavor profiles and cup score is incredibly important, but the line between useful and not useful can be kind of fine. So let's dissect different types of ways to communicate and how we can use that to build better relationships when talking about coffee quality. Specific notes and scores are incredibly valuable, but being overly precise or decorative with your language can sometimes distract from the conversation. Here's a couple of examples. A helpful way to describe a particular coffee might be to say, this has a bright citric acidity with a clean body and sugary sweetness. It matches my expectations and I'll approve it. The reasons this is useful is because it confirms the profile preference and makes a clear decision. An unhelpful example of this might be to say, this coffee tasted like ruby red grapefruit, Meyer lemons, had slippery and supple body, turbinado sugar, 84% cacao. Reasons this isn't very helpful in this context is that it's overly specific, including regionally exclusive notes. It anthropomorphizes the coffee, and which may not translate well if there's a language barrier, and there's no clear decision made. While floral and exciting language can be very useful for selling our coffee to customers, when communicating with suppliers, sometimes this can create complications in communication. Here's another example of a helpful way to communicate about an 84-point coffee. I scored this coffee 84 points. I found that it was too simple and lacking acidity for the price at which it was offered and for me to use as a single origin. I have to decline this coffee. The reason this is helpful is because it includes precise sensory preferences and also provides a rationale and a decision based on that preference. An unhelpful example of this same coffee might be simply to say, dull, too simple, I reject it. The reasons this is not very helpful is because it's imprecise without a clear motivation. When it comes to known sensory defects, precision is key. And again, there are a couple of ways that this can be communicated in both helpful and unhelpful ways. Let's look at a few examples. If you need to reject a coffee because it presented a sensory defect, one helpful way to describe it might be to say, inconsistent cups, 1 of 5 had strong mold, other cups were okay, but I have to reject it. This is helpful because it communicates concisely the defect type, its intensity, and frequency. An unhelpful way to describe this same sample might be to say, musty, dank, sweaty, basement, off cups. It's unhelpful because it includes imprecise language without a clear indication of the known defect or its frequency. Perhaps the coffee that's in question is on the edge of fermented. A helpful way to describe this might be to say, pulpy flavors on the edge of ferment detected. Cups were consistent but concerning to me. This is helpful because it identifies the problem and offers a rationale and explanation. An unhelpful way to describe this might be to say, overripe berries, cheap wine, boozy. This is unhelpful because the flavor notes could be misinterpreted and no clear defect was identified. For a streamlined feedback format, try the following steps. First, identify approval or rejection. Second, answer the question, does this coffee meet my expectations? Third, if there is a defect, be sure to identify what type the defect is, how many samples were drawn, and how many cups were affected. Lastly, provide your sensory notes in a clear and concise communication format. Let's talk a little bit about preferences and flaws that aren't exactly known defects. This can be a bit of a tightrope sometime communicating, and again, clear and concise communication can help maintain and build relationships even when coffee is of questionable character. Avoiding speculation in this context can also help to bridge the gap between a person who's familiar with agricultural and process-driven flavors versus a person who's in a quality control lab and a sensory analyst who's more familiar with simple flavor attributes. This can help free up the conversation to existing solutions rather than making potentially erroneous recommendations that could have far-reaching consequences. I'm usually of the opinion that roasters and quality control agents on the consuming side of the equation shouldn't be providing specific agricultural and process-driven recommendations, at least not without the proper qualifications like an agronomy degree, or the kinds of financial backing that can make it feasible for the producer to make those choices and know that they will still be paid for their coffee regardless of the quality outturn. If you're asking a producer, a farmer, a processor to take on additional risk by making changes to their processing, you should be prepared to pay for that in advance. And be prepared to come to an equitable solution with that supply partner to make sure that everyone ends up happy at the end of the equation, even if the coffee doesn't turn out as expected. I would say, generally speaking, your best practice should be to listen to the suggestions of the grower or the processor who's likely in a better position to know what they have done and make recommendations on how to change it for the best. They are the experts in this scenario. We've talked a lot about negative feedback and how to communicate clearly when there's a problem with your coffee. However, don't forget to provide positive feedback to your supplier as well. This is a great way to continue building relationships. If you're loving the coffee that you're serving, let your roaster know. If you love the coffee that your exporter sent you, you should continue to work with them to get more like that in the future. That's the way these kinds of relationships work best. Good communication, clear identifying, good rationale, and the kinds of normal human interactions that build actual relationships can also help to build good trade relationships. They go hand in hand. Negative feedback can be really challenging too, and I just want to encourage you to be clear and careful with the way that you communicate. Acknowledge the fact that there is human on the other side of the communication timeline. Don't be overly aggressive or use extreme negative language, which can lead to a ruined relationship. If you work towards solutions rather than simply talking about problems, you have a much better chance of continuing a good relationship with that supply partner well into the future and getting good coffee also. When it comes to sample feedback, this is one of the most important types of communication coffee roasters and buyers can have with coffee sellers and suppliers across the supply chain. It really is the bridge of the gap between these two different types of organizations, and keeping in mind the clear humanity on both sides of the equation, a healthy respect for each other as individuals, and also respect for the time and energy that it takes to do the kinds of work that are involved. As a coffee supplier, I want to hear feedback on the coffee that I've sent out. I'd love to hear whether or not you liked it or didn't, and what I can do to improve in the future. In the same sense, I really enjoy sending feedback, especially when it's positive, to my supply partners when I'm purchasing coffee. Just being clear with good communication skills, a good time frame in mind, and a clear understanding of what type of sample you're evaluating are the keys to success in these kinds of relationships.